Have you ever reached the point where you think, I can't do it anymore, it's over for me? Have you ever felt like everything was falling apart, that praying no longer made sense, that God seemed to be silent while the world was crushing you? This story is for you. It is for those who have fought with all their strength but still fell, for those who found themselves alone in a dark room, surrounded by bills, diagnoses, rejections and thoughts that no one dares to confess. She is for those who said in a low voice, almost breathless, "Lord, if you still hear me, show me." This story is about a man who tried everything. Businesses went bankrupt, doors closed, friends disappeared. With each failed attempt, he lost more than money. He lost hope. And it was when there was nothing left to try that he decided to give up. But that's when something happened. It was there, at the bottom of the well, at the exact moment when everything seemed lost, that God arrived. Because God always arrives and arrives before the end. This story carries miracle, transformation, and a faith that was rebuilt in the midst of the pieces. And if you think you've seen it all, just wait until you hear what God has done. Because what seemed like the end point was just a comma in his plan. How many times have you asked yourself if it's worth continuing? How many times have you looked at the sky and thought God wasn't watching? Perhaps, like this man, you are now at your limit. And if that is the case, I invite you to watch until the end. This is not just a story of overcoming, it is a real testimony of God's actions, proof that he is never late, even when we think everything is lost. So prepare your heart, because what comes next could change your life. And if you know someone who is about to give up, this video needs to reach them. Now, take a deep breath, because the darkest moment in this story is about to be revealed, and it is exactly at this point that God shows who he is. Are you ready? So continue here, because what comes now is the beginning of the turnaround. Before continuing, let me give you a warning. This is not just another video. While many are distracted, stuck in routines, despairing about the news, God is speaking, acting, and preparing hearts for the last days. And every testimony like this is a sign, a warning, a call to faith. This is not the time to be silent. This is not the time to leave it for later. You need to be attentive. It needs to be connected to what God is doing now, because time is running out and the evidence is everywhere. In the pain, in the losses, in the twists and turns, and in the miracles that no one can explain. This story you are about to follow is not only exciting, it is prophetic. It shows what happens when everything seems over, but heaven decides to intervene. And that's why I ask you, leave your like now. This isn't just for engagement. It's so that this message reaches more people who are on the verge of giving up. Subscribe to the channel, because here you will continue to hear stories that not only move, but awaken. Stories that show that God is still speaking and he is coming back. Don't leave it for later. Why the next miracle can start with a simple click. Let's go together. What comes next will prove to you that when man gives up, God begins. John was 42 years old, an ordinary man, the kind you pass on the street and don't even notice. He has always been known for his dedication and honesty. A tireless worker, he started early in the electrical maintenance business. With effort and faith, he managed to open his own company. Small, but enough to support the family he loved so much. Married for 15 years to Patricia, father of Ana Luisa and little Caio, João was, until then, the picture of stability. He wasn't rich, but he was happy. Weekends at home, simple barbecues in the backyard, family services on Sunday, all of this was part of a routine that he valued, like gold. And when they asked what success was, he said, "It's seeing my children sleeping with their bellies full and their hearts at peace." For him, that was enough. João didn't dream too big. He just wanted to keep what he built with so much sweat standing. His small business was doing well. He had some fixed contracts and loyal customers, nothing extraordinary, but enough to live with dignity and even help other families with jobs. But life sometimes seems to test even the strongest. And It was from one moment to the next that the ground began to give way. First, he lost one of his biggest contracts, then another. Within weeks, he saw his company lose half of its monthly rent. He tried to keep his employees. He held on as long as he could, but he couldn't do it anymore. He started delaying payments. The peace that was at the breakfast table began to give way to silence. Patricia noticed her husband's distant look. Ana Luisa, at just 13 years old, already realized that something was not going well, and Caio, still little, asked why Dad was always angry or tired. João tried to hide it, but fear had already made its home inside him. Prayed, of course, every day, but he felt like his words hit the ceiling and came back. He was no longer sure if God heard him. I no longer knew if I was still worthy of a response. The company continued to decline. Bills were piling up. The feeling of failure began to eat away at his identity. He, who was the provider, the pillar, now felt useless. And when a man loses his identity, he begins to disconnect from his purpose. João no longer smiled. I no longer dreamed. He just survived. Patricia tried to keep faith, saying that everything would pass, that God was in control. But his faith was too weak to feed on the hope of others. He needed something real, something that would rekindle the flame he once had. He started looking for human solutions. He thought about loans, tried to sell the car, did everything to maintain his dignity. But it seemed like the more he tried, the more the doors closed, and it was destroying him from the inside. The feeling of helplessness, the constant fear of failing your family, the shame of feeling incapable, all of this accumulated like a storm ready to explode. He tried to maintain his routine, as if everything was normal. He took his children to school, said good morning to his wife, looked at his emails with a hopeful face. But it was all a facade. Inside, he was broken, a man in ruins, who could barely look in the mirror without asking himself, where did I go wrong? Have you ever felt this? Have you ever had the feeling that everything you've built is slipping through your fingers and that not even your prayers can contain the disaster? João was exactly at that point. He knew what it was to serve God. He grew up in the church, participated in retreats, and had seen miracles. But now he was just a name in the chaos. Just another man trying to pretend that everything is fine when his soul was already screaming for help. And this is where most people start to get lost, because the enemy knows exactly where to attack, in identity, purpose, and faith. João, at that moment, was a vulnerable target. And the worst part, he felt alone. So alone that he thought God had forgotten him, that maybe heaven was too busy to hear yet another desperate request from a broke man. But let me tell you something, and if this speaks to you, comment below. Have you ever gone through a phase where it felt like heaven was closed to you? Have you ever felt that no matter how much you prayed, everything stayed the same or even got worse? If so, comment here. I've felt that. Let's create a space of faith here in the comments, because you are not alone. What John didn't know was that even when God seems silent, he continues to act. Sometimes he allows the valley, not because he wants to destroy us, but because it is there, in the valley, that he reveals who we really are and who he really is. What would come after that point, João could never imagine, because when everything seems lost, God not only arrives, he arrives before it's too late. But that is what you will understand in the next moment of this story. And I'm warning you, what comes next will shake you. It will make you rethink a lot of things. Why there are encounters with God that only happen when everything we had falls apart. And that's exactly when something started to change. Not visibly, not immediately, but in the invisible. God was already preparing what no one imagined. Are you still with me? So hold on tight, because rock bottom isn't the end yet. It was just the beginning of something that only God could write. The decline wasn't immediate, but the speed with which everything fell apart seemed cruel. João began to feel the weight of bankruptcy when one of his oldest contracts was cancelled without notice. The client who had trusted their services for years, decided to cut costs and end the contract. João tried to talk, renegotiate, offer a discount, but nothing worked. Days later, another customer followed the same path. In a matter of weeks, more than half of his monthly income disappeared like water slipping through his fingers. The company that took him years to build began to wither as if it was being slowly suffocated. The phone that used to ring every day with new services has gone silent. WhatsApp, where I received orders and closed deals, became a field of silence, and with that silence came fear. Not a common fear, but the kind that paralyzes. Fear of the future, fear of not being able to pay for children's schooling, fear of opening the fridge and seeing that the essentials were missing, fear of needing to ask for help, fear of admitting that I had failed, and the worst, fear that God was seeing everything and yet remained silent. João had to make tough decisions. He had to fire his employees, people who had been with him since the beginning, people who believed in their dream, who grew up with it. It was one of the most difficult scenes of his life, looking each person in the eye and saying he couldn't go on any longer. Each dismissal was like taking away a piece of yourself, and after everyone left, he was alone, literally. Sitting in the company's empty warehouse, looking at the tools, the empty shelves, the deafening silence of a shattered dream. The bills started piling up. Electricity, water, space rental, IPVA, credit card delayed materials. The slips formed a tall pile on the table, each one with a red date and a veiled threat of being cut off or charged. João tried to juggle with the little he had, but the math no longer added up. And what to do when the account doesn't add up? Hope disappears and faith falters. He isolated himself. He began to spend more time in silence, locked in his room. Patricia asked him what was happening and he responded with, "It's okay." That didn't even convince him. The key. Children who used to run to him when he arrived home began to find the silence strange, the lost look, the absence even though he was present. João was no longer the same. He carried an invisible weight that bowed his shoulders and dimmed the shine in his eyes. Deep down, he felt like he was sinking. It wasn't just the company that was going bankrupt. It was him. The soul was broken. Faith, once firm, was now a distant memory. He wondered if God was still there, if he heard his prayers, if there was some purpose in all of this. And when I couldn't hold it in any longer, I cried. He cried alone, quietly, so as not to worry anyone. But he cried like a child who had lost his ground, because that was exactly what he felt, as if he were in a desert, with no direction, no shelter, no water. And in those moments of silence, when everything seemed to stand still, the enemy whispered, "God has forgotten you." How many times does this lie seem true when we are at rock bottom, right? Maybe you've heard this too, and if you've heard it, comment here. I know what it's like, because this space is for real people, people who have already collapsed, who have faced sleepless nights, who have even doubted their own faith. With each new day, the anguish increased. João woke up with a knot in his stomach and slept with a heavy heart. He began to feel useless, disposable, a nuisance. I avoided seeing my friends. I didn't want to hear questions like, "How are things?" He didn't know what else to answer. He began to think that perhaps he was paying for some past mistake, some forgotten sin. Was God allowing all of this as a form of correction? Or could it be that in fact the Lord had departed? What João couldn't see, and what many of us don't see when we're in the middle of the storm, is that God never abandons his own. Even when the sky seems bronze, even when the silence is deafening, he is there. But John didn't know that yet. He only saw chaos. I only felt the weight of shame, the helplessness, the hopelessness that consumed even the desire to pray. And this is a very delicate point in the journey of faith. When we stop praying, not because we have lost faith for good, but because we no longer have the strength to believe that we will be heard. The worst part of all this was not the financial loss. It was the loss of hope. Because when hope goes away, darkness sets in. João got to the point where he looked in the mirror and didn't recognize himself. That determined man, full of plans and faith, was now a pale reflection with deep circles under his eyes and an empty look. He no longer knew how to go back to who he was. And this feeling of being broken, of having no way out, is one of the cruelest feelings anyone can face. It is what many call the dark night of the soul. He started to question everything: life, faith, purpose. I sat on the living room floor after everyone was asleep and stayed there in silence, staring into space. Sometimes I would doze off on the couch with the TV on, just so I wouldn't hear the noise of my own thoughts. Other times, he walked around the house like a ghost, trying to find a reason to continue. He thought about giving up everything, to sell what little he had, abandon everything and leave, or worse, simply disappear. Because in his mind, the idea of giving up started to seem like a reasonable option. But have you ever noticed how does God, even in silence, always set the stage? He allows emptiness not to destroy us, but to create space for something new. And maybe this is what you need to hear right now. God's silence is not absence, it is preparation. John was about to find out, because at the moment when everything seemed too dark, an invisible thread began to move. Something he didn't see, but was happening. In the sky, in the invisible, God was already writing the next chapter. A chapter that would begin at the lowest point in its history, but that would change everything. Stay with me, because what happens when everything reaches its limit is what reveals the true power of faith. That night, everything felt heavier than ever. The house was plunged into a suffocating silence, as if even the air knew something was about to happen. Patricia and the children were already asleep. The clock in the living room showed just over midnight, and João was sitting on the edge of the bed, completely still, staring into space. The dim light from the lamp illuminated his trembling hands, and on top of them, a crumpled sheet of paper. The letter, a farewell letter. He had spent hours trying to write those words. He tore off 3 sheets first. None seemed enough. None could express the pain he carried. But that one he managed to finish. It was short, direct, written with a lump in my throat and my heart in pieces. He didn't explain much. He just said that he tried, that he fought, that he loved his family, but that he couldn't take it anymore. João even folded the letter carefully, as if it was something sacred, and placed it on the bedside table, next to a photo of the family taken years before on a walk in the park. The image showed a smiling João, with Ana Luisa on his shoulders and Caio on his lap. Patricia at her side hugged the 3 of them with that trusting look. And that was what hurt the most. That image no longer reflected reality. He was no longer that man. At least that's how he felt. The rain was falling outside, beating against the window in a rhythm that seemed to follow the rapid beat of João's heart. He slowly got up, walked to the window and stood there, staring at the dark sky and the drops running down the glass. The storm seemed to have chosen that night on purpose, as if the entire universe was saying, "There is no more light for you." And John believed it. He believed it was the end, that everything he could offer had already been exhausted, that not even God would answer anymore. At that moment, he didn't want anyone to see him weak. I didn't want to worry Patricia, nor leave Anna and Caio with memories of a defeated father. But the pain was so much that he began to feel his body tingle. I was sweating cold. He was breathing deeply, trying to stay upright, but inside he was broken in a way that he didn't know if he could ever fix it. And then, with teary eyes, he whispered to himself, "God, if you're still there, give me a sign now, because I won't be able to continue." Silence. The rain continued to hit the window. The hands of the clock advanced as if mocking his weight. Nothing happened. No lights shone. No voices echoed. And that was when João began to despair. Because at that moment, he truly believed he had been abandoned, that not even heaven wanted anything to do with him anymore. He returned to bed, looked at the letter once more. The hands were shaking. The tears were now flowing uncontrollably. And when his fingers touched the drawer where he kept the medicine. Something unexpected happened. A noise, a snap, a sound coming from the room. John froze. It was dawn. Everyone was sleeping, and he knew he hadn't left anything on. Frightened, he stood up with his heart in his throat. He walked slowly, as if each step were dragged by an invisible weight. When he arrived in the living room, he saw the TV on, but he was sure he turned it off. The screen displayed a Christian channel. A pastor on his knees prayed in tears, and the words that came out of that man's mouth pierced John like an arrow. If you are there now, thinking about giving up, thinking that there is no way out, I need to tell you that God sent this moment to you. He is with you. He still has plans. Don't give up. Not today. John fell to his knees right there in the middle of the room. Not because he was religious, not by ritual, but because the impact was so strong, so personal, so supernatural he couldn't stand. It was as if God had opened the sky for a second and sent a message straight to his heart. And John wept. He cried like never before. She cried with shame, with relief, with gratitude, and with fear at the same time. He knew what he was about to do, and now he knew that God did not allow that to be the end. And maybe that's what you need to hear right now. Maybe you are also holding a quit letter in some area of your life. Maybe you're feeling exactly like John, tired, invisible, frustrated, with a wounded soul. Maybe you even thought that God forgot you, but look here. The fact that you are watching this video now, listening to this story, is no coincidence. God does not work with coincidence. He works with purpose, and he uses stories like this to reach hearts at the exact moment of pain. Can you tell how serious this is? Can you feel that it's not just about John, but also about you? If so, comment here now. God spoke to me. Because when you write, you declare. And when you declare, heaven responds. This isn't about emotion. It's about spirituality. It's about discernment. It's about knowing that God acts with surgical precision, and that when he enters history, he never enters late. That night marked a turning point in João's life. The bills didn't disappear. The contracts didn't return. The bank account was still in the red. But something inside him had changed. What seemed dead began to pulse again. Not because of a visible miracle, but because of the invisible certainty that God saw him. About what God didn't let him fall. About what God arrived first. The storm was still raging outside, but inside João, the silence had been broken. The voice from heaven had been heard, and that was just the first whiff of what God was about to do. And you? Have you ever had a moment like this? Have you ever lived through a moment when everything seemed lost, but something supernatural reached you before the worst? If you've experienced this, share it in the comments with, I am proof that God arrives at the right time. Let's flood this space with living testimonies. Let's show the world that God still speaks, what God still acts, that when everything says it's over, he gets up. Because what comes next in John's life will prove, once and for all, that the end of the line for man is the starting point for God's action. And this turnaround, you need to see it with your own eyes. The presence of God often does not arrive with noise. It invades the environment silently, but with a strength that no human being can explain. And that's exactly how it happened that morning. After the unexpected prayer broadcast on TV, after the shock of hearing a man saying exactly what João needed to hear, something in him broke, but not a destructive break. It was a necessary break, a surrender of the soul. For the first time in a long time, he allowed the pain to manifest itself without resistance. And when his knees touched the cold living room floor, it wasn't on impulse. It was out of necessity. John gave himself up, there between tears and tiredness, without rehearsed words, without spiritual formulas. He prayed, not as someone who follows a ritual, but as a child who cries out for help. The words came brokenly, full of sobs, but full of truth. God, if you are still with me, show me. Show me that the Lord has not given up on me, because I don't know what to do anymore. That wasn't just a prayer. It was a cry from the soul. It was the explosion of months of silence, frustration, and anguish, swallowed dry. The atmosphere in the house changed, not because the light shone, nor because an audible voice responded, but because at that moment, the connection between John and God was re-established. Something invisible, spiritual, and profound happened. And do you know what that is? It is the touch of the Holy Spirit, God's visitation at a time when no one else could enter. When the heart truly opens, heaven responds, and no matter the size of the hole a person finds themselves in, God reaches out. João didn't notice the time passing. He remained there, prostrate, for long minutes, crying, talking, asking for forgiveness. He confessed his fears, his failures, his darkest feelings. He said he felt weak, small, ashamed. And in the midst of that sincere conversation with the Father, a different peace began to invade the environment. It wasn't the solution to the problems. Nothing had changed on the outside. But inside him, a thread of light lit up. Have you ever felt this peace? That doesn't depend on circumstances. The one that comes when we simply hand everything over to God. If you have ever experienced something like this, write it here in the comments. I know what this peace is. Maybe your story is in another chapter. Maybe you are still in chaos, but that peace can find you right now. Because it doesn't come from the world, it comes from heaven. And it starts when we surrender. João didn't ask for riches. He didn't ask for magical solutions. In that prayer, he only asked for one thing, presence. Lord, you won't leave me alone. And that request was granted. Because when we sincerely seek God, he reveals himself. And it was there, on the cold floor of the room, with his face wet with tears, that John had his first true encounter with God in a long time. It wasn't in church, it wasn't in worship, it was in pain, it was in desperation, it was in the silent dawn that he was present. The music in the background of the TV was still playing. It was a soft piano, as if cradling that prayer with affection, and João, for the first time, felt like he could breathe. Even though the storm continued outside, something calmed inside him. It was as if the Spirit of God whispered in his heart, I'm here. I never left. And these words were not spoken with sound, but with presence. For sure, with peace. And you know what's stronger? It's just that many people listening to this story now may have never experienced this kind of encounter. Perhaps you are experiencing similar chaos. Maybe your letter is already written. Maybe the knees are still locked. But let me tell you, God is there now. He knows every detail of your pain, every hidden thought, every tear that no one saw, and he is waiting for your moment of surrender, not because he demands perfection, but because he acts in delivery. João was not cured of his sadness overnight. He didn't wake up with all the problems resolved, but something had changed. That dark room, once full of anguish, now carried a light that came from within. He lay down on the couch, still crying, but with a light heart. He slept like he hadn't slept in weeks, not because everything was resolved, but because finally he had delivered. And surrender releases God's action. And it's important to remember this: God doesn't need perfection, he needs space. João, by opening his heart, created this space, a place where God could work, guide, and restore. And are you still trying to figure everything out on your own? Are you fighting with human forces for something that only heaven can fix? Do you also need to stop and get down on your knees? This is the question that needs to echo in your heart right now, because the miracle that would come in John's life did not begin with solving the problems. It started with brokenness, with real prayer, with the recognition that he could no longer do it alone. And that changed everything. And if you're still watching this video, that's no coincidence. This is an invitation. I invite you to surrender too, to give up control, to say with humility, Lord, I can't handle it, but I know that the Lord can. Can you say that today? Can you open your heart? If this word speaks to you, comment here, I deliver, Lord, because this delivery is the beginning of a new beginning. It was like that with João. It could be like that with you too. What would come next in his life was unpredictable. There was still a lot of struggle, a lot of doubts, a lot of difficult days. But one thing was different. Now he knew he was no longer alone. And when you know that God is with you, everything changes, even what hasn't changed on the outside yet. And it was with this new conviction, still fragile but true, that João took his next step, because the miracle was just beginning to unfold. The next morning came like any other, with the same gray sky, the same distant sound of the city waking up, and the same silence inside the house. But something had changed. João woke up with his eyes swollen from crying, his body still tired, but there was a strange relief in his chest. It was as if a ton had been removed from my shoulders during that prayer the previous morning. He still couldn't explain what it was, but something made him breathe deeper. The pain hadn't gone away, the problems hadn't evaporated, but there was a different peace, a silent certainty that something was happening, even if he couldn't see it yet. He lay there for a few minutes, looking at the ceiling, remembering every word he said the night before. That desperate prayer, the knee on the floor, the choking cry, and the indescribable feeling of being heard by God. It was all so real, so intimate. John knew that something spiritual had broken. He felt exposed before God, but not judged. On the contrary, he felt welcomed, beloved, despite everything. It was in this atmosphere of inexplicable peace that he got up from the bed. He passed through the kitchen, in silence, grabbed a simple coffee and sat on the sofa, still silent, just observing the house. Every detail seemed more alive. It was as if God had placed a new filter on his vision. The clock said just after 8 when the phone rang. The loud and sudden sound broke the mood of reflection and made João jump in fright. He looked at his cell phone screen and froze for a moment. The number that appeared was familiar, but unexpected. It was from an old client, one he hadn't seen in over 2 years. Demanding man with whom João had worked on a major project in the past. The heart accelerated. He hesitated to answer for a second. After all, in recent times, every phone call seemed to be a demand, a warning, or pressure. But something inside him whispered, "Answer," and he answered. On the other end of the line, a firm but friendly voice said, "João, boy, it's been a long time. I have a new project here and I thought of you. I remembered your dedication, your seriousness. Are you still working with electricity?" John stuttered for a second, heart racing, the mind trying to process. Yes, of course, yes," he replied, almost voicelessly. The client continued, "Great, because I need someone I can trust. It's a big contract. It's not easy, but you've always been good at it. Can you come here this week?" João hung up the phone, unable to contain his tears. It was as if the sky had responded in a clear, direct, palpable way. He got up from the sofa, walked around the room as if he didn't know what to do with his own body. He laughed and cried at the same time. He took out his cell phone and checked the number again, as if he wanted to make sure it was real. And it was. It was real. God had heard. God had answered. At that moment, the verse came to mind like a divine whisper. "Call to me and I will answer you, and I will tell you great and sure things that you do not know." Jeremiah 33:3. He had not just cried out, he had collapsed at the feet of God, without masks, without religiosity. And the God who hears, the God who sees in secret, responded with precision. But the miracle was not just in the contract. The real miracle was in that peace that John felt. Peace in the midst of war, hope in the midst of chaos. For the first time in months, he felt alive, not because everything was magically resolved, but because something inside him was restored. He knew now that he was not alone. And knowing this changes everything. It changes the way we face bills, problems, decisions. Change the tone of your voice, change the brightness of your eyes, even change your posture. Because when the soul finds shelter in God, the outside begins to reflect this. Later that day, Patricia noticed the difference. John was smiling, a shy but sincere smile. He sat at the table with his children and for the first time in a long time started a conversation. He spoke of hope. He talked about starting over. He didn't mention all the details, but his eyes told a story that words couldn't yet convey. And at night, before going to sleep, he prayed with his family, out loud, hand in hand. The prayer was simple, but filled with gratitude. And while saying, "Thank you, Lord, for not giving up on me," Ana Luisa squeezed his hand tightly, Gaius smiled, and Patricia cried in silence. This is how God works. It transforms the scene, yes, but first, it transforms the heart. And when he finds a broken heart, ready to start over, he shows that he is still the same God as always. The God who opens paths in the desert, who brings life to dry valleys, who resurrects dreams and restores what seemed lost. Have you ever experienced something like this? Have you ever had a day when everything changed with a simple phone call, an unexpected message, a response that you didn't even know would come? If you've experienced this, comment here. God answered me too. Let's spread these testimonies here in the comments, because every response from God is living proof that he still acts, that the sky still moves in favor of those who cry out. João knew that the road would still be long, what new challenges would arise. But now, something essential was back. Faith, not theoretical faith, learned by ear, but lived faith. The faith that is reborn in the dust of pain and rises with strength at the right moment. He would still have to organize his accounts, renegotiate debts, catch his breath, but I wouldn't do it alone anymore. Because now, he knew that God was with him, that the same God who allows the fall is the one who sustains the climb, and every step he took now had a new sound, not the sound of the chains of guilt, but the sound of freedom, of hope that pulses again, the certainty that even when the end seems inevitable, God has a new beginning prepared. That late afternoon, João went out for a little walk. He looked at the sky, he took a deep breath, and he thanked me once again. Life hadn't been perfect again, but now it made sense, because what he experienced was more than a contract, more than an open door. He experienced a reunion with purpose, with the so-called, with the certainty that God still had something great prepared, and this conviction would be the fuel for the coming days. Because what God started that morning was still just beginning. What happened in the following days was like the blossoming of a garden that had been covered by the shadow of drought for a long time. It wasn't a noisy miracle, the kind that comes with lightning and thunder. It was a silent but profound transformation. João began to see life with new eyes. The contract with the former client really came to fruition, and that work brought not only a financial boost, but also an opportunity to rediscover what he did well, what he loved. He didn't go back to being the same businessman he was before. He became a new man, a man shaped by the desert, shaped by pain, but now sustained by a faith that had been restored. And that's precisely what many people don't understand. The true miracle isn't just the door that opens, it's the heart that changes. John now walked with purpose. The company began to recover little by little. New services emerged, and with each of them, he witnessed it. Not just about business, but about the God who rescued him from the abyss, because he knew, and he said it firmly, that if God hadn't intervened that morning, everything would have ended. One night, he was invited to give a brief testimony at church. He was not a preacher, he never saw himself as someone in the pulpit, but that night, with a choked voice and teary eyes, he went up to the altar holding Patricia's hands, with Ana Luisa and Caio sitting in the first row, attentive as if they were listening to a hero. And in a way they were, because here was a man who overcame darkness, a man who was sustained by the power of prayer and God's grace, even when all seemed lost. João took the microphone and took a deep breath. He looked ahead at that full temple, but his heart was elsewhere. In that room, that morning, in that moment when he fell to his knees and just asked God to see him. "I was ready to give up," he said, his voice shaking, "but God beat me to it." The church fell silent. Some were crying, others just lowered their heads, because when a truth like this is spoken with the weight of experience, it doesn't need shouting. It echoes in the soul. And this sentence became the summary of everything. "I was ready to give up, but God beat me to it." She became a seed. He began to repeat it in every conversation, at every opportunity that arose. When he found someone discouraged, João told his story. When he knew someone was on the verge of a desperate decision, he shared that moment, that prayer, that phone call. He had become a channel of hope, not because his life was perfect now, but because he knew what it meant to be sustained by grace in the midst of imperfection. Maybe you're wondering, how can someone come out of such a desperate state and still say that that's where they found true faith? But that is the beauty of walking with God. It is in the deepest pains that he reveals the grandest plans. João learned that rock bottom is often the only place where we look up. And it was when there was no more strength, no resources, no hope, that he discovered that heaven was still standing and that God never stopped working in his favor. And now, looking back, João does not feel ashamed of what he experienced. He feels gratitude because it was tears that led him to the meeting. It was weakness that paved the way for divine strength. It was silence that taught him to listen to the voice of God with his heart. He discovered that when we stop chasing human solutions and simply bend the knee, the answer comes. It may not be the way we imagine. It may not be in the time we expect, but she comes because God is faithful and he honors the broken hearts. At church, João began participating in a prayer group. He wasn't the guy who talked much, but whenever he got the chance, he would say, no matter how dark the night is, God always arrives before the dawn. And this phrase, simple and full of truth, touched hearts. A lot of people started opening up to him, people who were going through financial difficulties, marital crises, illnesses. And João, with the eyes of someone who has been deep inside, knew how to listen. I knew how to pray. I knew how to guide, because the pain he experienced turned into ministry, on mission. And perhaps you, who have been following this story so far, are also being called to this. Maybe your pain is not the end of the line, but the beginning of something that God wants to use to reach others. Have you thought about that? Have you ever stopped to imagine that the fight you are facing today could be the testimony that will save someone tomorrow? If this idea resonates with you, comment here, "Sir, use my story." Because when we surrender even pain into God's hands, it becomes an instrument on bridge, in hope for someone. João still faces challenges. Life has not become a fairy tale, but now he has an unshakable conviction. God has not left him. And that certainty changes everything. Changes the way he deals with problems. It changes the way he talks to his family. It changes the way he views the future, because now he knows that the walk is no longer lonely. God is with him. And that's all that matters. In that service, at the end of his testimony, he knelt with his family at the altar. The low lights, the soft music in the background, the people in prayer. And there, in front of the altar, he asked for no more things. He just said thank you. And as he prayed, he felt his children's hands on his shoulders and his wife's silent embrace. It was as if God was saying once again, "I am here. I always have been." This scene, recorded in the eyes of those who were present, is a reminder that the miracle is not just in what God does, it is in what he builds in us. And perhaps like João, you are also one step away from this reunion, on one knee bent, to a sincere prayer, to a moment of surrender. And if you made it this far with us, tell me in the comments, "I want this reunion too," because sometimes all God needs is a simple delivery to start the transformation. The miracle begins when faith awakens, when the soul returns to believing, yes, there is still hope. there is still a plan. There's still time, because no matter how late it seems, God always arrives first. If this story spoke to you, if at some point you found yourself in João's shoes, felt this tightness in your chest, and this presence of God touched you in some way, then you cannot leave here without doing two very important things. First, subscribe to the channel right now. Here you will find real testimonies, stories that edify, messages that strengthen faith and show every day that God still acts and is never late. Be part of this family of faith with us. Your registration helps this message reach those who need hope most right now. Second, if you got this far, it's because God sustained you until the end. So comment below, "I was ready to give up, but God spoke to me." Write this in the comments so that we can pray for you, and so that others who come later also feel that they are not alone. Let's fill this comment section with faith, with life, with transformation, because when we share what God has done, He continues to do it. And now that you've followed this story to the end, you can see how God transforms even the most impossible scenarios. And there's more coming. In the next video, you will meet someone who lost everything in an even more unexpected way: a family, work, dignity, and at the moment the entire world turned its back, was surprised by a divine response that no one could explain. It is one of those testimonies that make us rethink our lives and realize that God's actions have no human logic. So get ready, because what you will hear next has the power to ignite faith in even the most hurt hearts. What God did there was simply supernatural.